pra sair no Oslodum. Bloco asfo da terra do pai.
Oi, tudo bem? Welcome to the 7th lesson and the special series I've created to help you to jumpstart your Brazilian Portuguese. I'm Professor Jason, and today I'll be teaching you how to come up with present tense forms for regular verbs in Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, and how to use those forms to create basic sentences and to ask and answer simple questions. Now, verbs, verb conjugation, clearly this is a very important topic, so please pay close attention, see if we can learn something here. Então, vamos começar. Let's get started. Okay, so just to give you a brief overview of what we'll be talking about, first we're going to look at what is verb conjugation, just so we all know what we're talking to, what we're referring to. Secondly, I'm going to review the subject pronouns in Brazilian Portuguese, which we covered, I believe it was in lesson 3, and I'll point out the 4 main conjugation positions. Then we're going to talk about the 3 main verb classes in Portuguese, AR, ER, and IR verbs. Then I'll explain how to produce the 4 forms for each of those verb classes. And as I do that, you'll see plenty of examples of present tense forms in simple declarative sentences. And then really quickly, since we'll cover this in a separate lesson, I'll explain how to use these present tense forms to ask and answer simple questions. Alright, so just what is verb conjugation? Well, when you hear people say conjugation in the context of language learning, they're referring to taking the base form of a verb, which is known as the infinitive, and generating the form or forms that pair with the subject or the person or thing that's carrying out the action. So, as we can see from the examples on the slide, in English verbs have 2 different forms in the present tense. Whether we say speak or speaks depends on the subject, on who's doing the speaking. We can see on this slide that in Brazilian Portuguese things are arguably a bit more complicated, since a verb in the present tense typically has 4 different forms. For example, falo, fala, falamos, and falam. So long story short, when people talk about conjugating, they're talking about producing the form of the verb that matches the subject. Now that being the case, it's probably worth our while to review the subject pronouns and positions in Brazilian Portuguese. Alright, so on this slide what we see is the subject pronoun grid or paradigm for Brazilian Portuguese. Now if you want a more thorough review, I recommend that you go back to lesson 3, which focused on this very topic, subject pronouns. But for now, I'll just point out a couple of things that are key to our discussion of present tense forms of regular verbs. Remember that subject pronouns can be either singular or plural, and that they can also refer to first, second, or third persons. So, for example, the subject pronoun eu or I represents the first person singular position, whereas tu or você represent the second person singular, and ele, ela, or names like José or Ana Carolina would be third person and singular. Nós is the first person plural position, and so on. And for the purposes of verb conjugation, this chart can really be collapsed into just 4 positions, since, as you can see, the verb forms used for você and vocês coincide with those used for the third person singular and plural positions. Now, for the record, and because I'm sure someone will ask about it or point it out, and it's a difference between Brazilian and European Portuguese, there are in fact forms that correspond to the pronoun tu in Brazilian Portuguese. But they're not used consistently, even in regions where people use that pronoun, except in careful speech. So again, there really is no reason to learn any more than 4 forms of any given verb, which is the approach that we'll follow in the rest of this lesson. Alright, before we take a look at how to generate the 4 forms that correspond to the 4 subject position categories we saw in the previous slides, I wanted to introduce a few verbs so that you can see Brazilian Portuguese has 3 main classes or types of verbs. Verbs ending in AR, such as amar, comprar, estudar, falar, lavar, morar, e trabalhar. Verbs ending in ER, like aprender, beber, comer, querer, receber, vender, and viver. And finally, verbs ending in IR, and generally there are fewer verbs in this third class. So verbs like abrir, assistir, partir, and permitir. Let me just say here that learning how to conjugate verbs makes very little sense if you don't know what verbs mean. So I'd like to encourage you to always include verbs in your study of vocabulary. If you really want to communicate with any degree of proficiency, you'll need to know the meanings of dozens and dozens, hundreds of verbs like these. So later in the same series, I'll present a couple of lessons on need-to-know verbs, but today I'm introducing just a few and focusing on how to produce the right forms. So in the next few slides, we'll look at how the 4 present tense forms for each of these verbs, or verb classes, not each of these verbs, but sample verbs from each of these 3 classes, how the 4 forms are formed. Okay, now let's begin by looking at how we come up with the forms for AR verbs, the first class. Remember, we're talking about 4 conjugation positions because there are more than 4 pronouns and really an almost infinite number of people or things that can function as subjects of sentences. So the thing is, in Brazilian Portuguese, you can handle all of them with just 4 forms of a verb in a given tense. On this slide, you can see that we're using the verb falar as a model for all regular AR verbs. By regular, I mean just that they follow the simple rules for producing the 4 forms. They fit the pattern, so to speak. There are no changes to their stems or endings. Later in the series, we'll see plenty of examples of irregular verb forms, which need to be memorized generally. Okay, so how do we conjugate? Back to that idea. In general, the pattern used to conjugate all verbs in the present tense is the same, the one you see on this slide. We begin with the infinitive in mind, split the stem off by removing the final 2 letters, and then add the endings that mark both the tense and the subject position or conjugation position. In the case of regular AR verbs like falar, to speak, those endings are u or o, a, amos, and on. So again, the 4 forms of the verb falar in the present tense would be falo, fala, falamos, falam. So those were the forms. Let's now take a look at how we could use those 4 forms of falar in some simple declarative sentences. Now these kinds of sentences are very easy to form. Their syntax is virtually the same as that of English sentences, similar English sentences. You start with a subject, then you add a verb, and some kind of complement or object. So subject, verb, and then an optional complement / object. Some examples would be, eu falo inglês, I speak English. Você fala italiano, you speak Italian. Ele fala muito bem, very well. Nós falamos português, we speak. Vocês falam espanhol. Eles falam muito rápido, very fast. Alright, now one thing I've decided to do with this lesson is to include some notes on pronunciation because I think the pronunciation of verb forms in Brazilian Portuguese is very important. So, it's important to note that when pronouncing verb forms in the present tense, the stress falls on the second to last syllable. So it's falo, fala, falamos, falam. Also note that the final vowels of the eu, você, and third person singular forms are weakened to the u and a sound because they're unstressed. So what you usually hear is eu falo, você fala, ela fala, etc. Also with AR verbs whose final stem vowels, now think this through, the final vowel in the stem are either e or o, those sounds actually open to e and o in the eu, você, vocês, and third person singular and plural forms. Now you'll probably need to rewind that. So you're going to hear gosto for the verb like gostar, and a verb with an o in the stem. Eu gosto, você gosta, eles gostam. Chegar, that e in the stem is going to open to e. Eu chego, ela chega, vocês chegam. Additionally, the pronunciation of the final syllable of the forms ending with am is nasalized. So it's vocês falam, eles falam. So I'm going to try to point out aspects important to pronunciation as we go along, but always pay careful attention and listen for differences. Alright, so the other thing I'm going to do in this lesson is double up each class of verbs and give you examples of 2 different verbs just to reinforce. So let's look at a few more simple sentences featuring the forms of another regular AR verb. Okay, in this case, estudar. So notice that the forms used in these examples, right, estudo, estuda, etc., right, conform to the same pattern or rule for conjugation. We've taken the infinitive form, estudar, to study, removed the AR ending, and added the same endings that we used with the stem of falar. So for example, I study Portuguese, right? Remember, subject, verb, complement. Eu estudo português. Você estuda espanhol. Ela estuda latim. Nós estudamos juntos. We study together. Vocês estudam com ela, with her. Elas estudam alemão. Elas estudam alemão. Okay, so now let's look at the second class of verbs, ER verbs. And as you can see, we'll be using the verb comer, to eat, as our model verb. So the way that we conjugate the 4 basic forms of ER verbs is very similar to what we just saw with AR verbs. We remove the ER ending, the last 2 letters, from the infinitive, which gives us the stem, and then we add the endings that you can see on the slide here. So what this means is that the 4 forms of the verb comer in the present tense would be como, come, comemos, and comem. Alright then, let's take a look at those 4 forms of the regular ER verb comer in some simple declarative sentences. Again, remember the order is subject, verb, and then some kind of a complement or object. Eu como carne, você come frango, ele come em casa, nós comemos juntos, together, vocês comem fruta, eles comem vegetais. And again, I'm going to introduce some pronunciation notes. This does get a little bit complicated, so you might want to rewind and take some notes on this slide, this particular slide. So, as with the AR verbs, the final vowels of the eu, você, and the third person singular forms are weakened. They go to u and e because they're in an unstressed position. So it's eu como, você come, ele come, ela come, etc. So I'm overemphasizing that a little bit. Okay, but it's como. You don't usually hear como, como. You don't usually hear come, or you do usually hear come, not come. Okay. Also, in the case of ER verbs like comer and beber, that have, for example, an O and an A as the final vowel in their stems, comer, beber, the pronunciation of those vowels opens in the você, vocês, and third person forms, singular and plural, so that rather than the O sound in eu como and comemos, you pronounce something closer to O. Você come, ele come, vocês comem, eles comem. It's a hard sound for me, so I may not be doing it perfectly. And the A sound in bebo or bebemos is pronounced é. So it sounds like você bebe, ele bebe, vocês bebem, eles bebem. So from A to é, você bebe. And as with AR verbs, the pronunciation of the final syllable of the forms ending in em is nasalized. Vocês comem, eles comem, vocês bebem, eles bebem. So it's eng, that's the sound. Vocês comem, eles comem. And speaking of beber, right, here are a few examples or a few more sample sentences featuring that verb as another example of ER verbs, regular ER verbs. Now notice again that the forms used in these examples conform to the same pattern or rule for conjugation that we've been talking about. We've taken the infinitive form beber, to drink, removed the final 2 letters ER to give us the stem, and then added the same endings we used with the stem of the previous verb comer. So examples: eu bebo água, você bebe cerveja, beer, ela bebe vinho, wine. Nós bebemos leite, milk. Vocês bebem suco, just juice. And elas bebem chá, tea. And finally, let's look at the third class of verbs, or IR verbs. We're going to use the verb abrir, which means to open, as our model verb for IR verbs. So, the way that we conjugate for the four basic forms of IR verbs is, again, very similar to what we've seen with AR verbs and ER verbs. The process is to remove the final two letters, in this case IR, the ending, from the infinitive, giving us the stem, and adding the endings that you can see here to that stem. One thing to notice is that the first person plural, the nós or we form, is a little bit different with IR verbs than it is with ER verbs. It becomes imus, and that's the only difference in endings between ER and IR verbs. Okay? If we apply that pattern to the verb abrir, this is what we come up with. The four forms are abro, abri, abrimos, abrem. Abro, abri, abrimos, abrem. On this slide, then, we can see the four forms of the regular IR verb abrir in some simple declarative sentences, right? Things we can open. Eu abro a janela, the window. Você abre a porta, the door. Ele abre a caixa, the box. Nós abrimos a loja, we open the store. Vocês abrem os presentes, the presents. You open the presents. Vocês abrem os presentes. And they open the envelopes. Eles abrem os envelopes. Eles abrem os envelopes. As we saw with ER verbs, the final vowels of the eu, você, and third-person singular forms are weakened to u and e sounds normally because they're in an unstressed position. So what you'll usually hear will be eu abro, você abre, ele abre, ela abre, etc. Instead of eu abro, for example. Eu abro, você abre. And of course, the pronunciation of the final syllable of the forms ending in em is nasalized. Vocês abrem, eles abrem. Vocês abrem, eles abrem. And finally, some more simple sentences featuring the forms of another regular IR verb, in this case, assistir, which means to watch or to go to an event, right? So, eu assisto ao jogo, eu assisto ao jogo, você assiste esse seriado, you watch that TV series, ela assiste Seinfeld todo dia, every day, nós assistimos a aula, vocês assistem filmes na internet, elas assistem novelas, elas assistem novelas. Alright, so far we've seen plenty of examples of present tense verb forms in simple declarative sentences, but I thought it might also be a good idea to provide a few examples of simple questions. I'm going to keep this part very brief since this topic, questions, is going to be addressed in detail in another video lesson in this series. Forming simple questions in Brazilian Portuguese is actually very easy, provided they're simple. In most cases, you use the same syntactic structure as for declarative sentences. That would be, remember, subject, and then your verb, and then some kind of a complement. If you have a question word like when, or where, or why, that comes before the subject, as you can see in these examples. Do you study at the library? Você estuda na biblioteca? Você bebe cerveja? Você fala português? Vocês falam inglês? Does José work on Saturdays? José trabalha aos sábados? José trabalha aos sábados? And then one with a question word I threw in just for good measure. Where do you live? Onde você mora? Onde você mora? Now note that the first 5 questions are basically yes-no questions. To answer these kinds of questions in the affirmative, you usually just repeat the proper form of the verb and add sim for yes. If you want to answer in the negative, you can simply say no for no, no. Or you can follow up that no with a short explanation. In questions like the last one, which is not a yes or no question, you simply provide the information requested, usually using the same verb in the same tense. So again, we'll look at asking and answering questions in much greater detail in another video lesson in the series, but I thought you might want to see how you would answer these simple questions. So if somebody says, "Você estuda na biblioteca?" and you want to say yes, you say, "Estudo sim." I study. Estudo sim. Você bebe cerveja? Bebo sim. Or, não, não bebo cerveja. Você fala português? Você fala português? Falo sim. E você? And you? Vocês falam inglês? Falamos. Falamos sim. Or, não, não falamos inglês. José trabalha aos sábados? Não. Or, I could give a little bit more of an explanation. Não, mas ele trabalha aos domingos. No, but he does work on Sundays. And finally, with the question word, the interrogative pronoun, onde, where. Onde você mora? Moro no Rio de Janeiro. So there I have to actually give. It's not a yes-no question. I have to answer with the information. Onde você mora? Moro no Rio de Janeiro. I wish, right? Alright, that's it for Lesson 7 in my basic Brazilian Portuguese course. I hope you found this information on present tense regular verb forms to be clear, informative, and useful. If so, please share it with others, and, of course, let me know if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, okay? Be sure to catch my next lesson in this series, and don't forget to look for me on your favorite social media platforms. I'm almost everywhere. Thanks again for watching, and be sure to visit Professor Jason's channel again soon. Até breve. Ciao.
Eu vou pra Oslo, pra sair no Oslo